I'm here with my old friend Benjamin Bagby. I'm not really here with him. He's in Paris and I'm in the middle of nowhere, but I'm very happy to see him. Good morning, Ben, or afternoon, or wherever you are.
Yeah, it's early evening even.
We've known each other for a long time. Ben, as everybody will know, I think, is a co-founder of the ensemble Sequentia, which has been active for practically the whole length of the Middle Ages. He has put the Middle Ages on the map in many ways. As a singer, he has in the past sung all sorts of music, but has made an amazing specialty of the kind of music that people thought was so distant and difficult that it was difficult of access. And Ben has made it fun, real, and alive. And he's been doing it for a long time. So I'm delighted to have him here with me. Ben, tell us how'd you get started in all this stuff? I'm interested in how people first thought about early music or thought about music at all, and then what made you do the turn over towards the early side. Tell us about your early years.
My early years were like anybody growing up under my circumstances was school, music, and piano lessons.
Mm-hmm.
That was the standard fare for everyone. And I do remember very vividly when Van Cliburn won the Tchaikovsky piano competition, which I think was 1958, so that dates me. And it made a big impression on me because that was a huge political event also. For Americans, and his playing was absolutely stunning and captivating, and so I wanted immediately to start playing the most difficult Chopin uh, pieces, and but I had to start with the simplest things, learning notes and playing these ridiculous pieces we all have to play when we're starting out. And I was really impatient with that. I wanted to get to the real thing as soon as possible, but my hands didn't cooperate. So um, I ended up going more and more into singing. I went to schools that were particularly strong in music and theater. I was really lucky in that respect to have fantastic schools. And I got more and more interested in classical music and then in classical singing and German Lied and Bach and all the rest. And I didn't yet have a sense of what was early music. It was just classical
Hmm.
music. I might be listening to Benjamin Britten one day and Wozzeck the next, and then Rossini. It was all mixed together. But when I was 16, um, I went to a summer music camp, ostensibly to sing in a choir under the direction of Robert Shaw, who was quite a charismatic individual if there ever was one. And so I was really excited about singing all these masterpieces, including the Bach St. John Passion, in which I had a teeny role, um, which at 16 was a big deal for me. But this summer school, which was in Michigan, it was in Rochester, Michigan, um, was hosting at the same time an early music 2-week workshop by the New York Pro Musica Antiqua, which in those days was directed by a musicologist named John Reeves White,
Yes.
who succeeded Noah Greenberg in the and all of the students at the summer school got free tickets to their concert. We just had a free ticket, and my friends were all going, and I thought, okay, I'll go. It's free. Why not? And it was a concert of 13th century motets and songs of Guillaume de Machaut. And that was my initiation.
Huh.
It was in June. I'll never forget it. It was one of those moments when you can absolutely pinpoint that something changed. And that was an absolute click in my mind. I had no idea what I was listening to. It totally threw me for a loop. I was absolutely charmed and thrilled, and I instantly needed to know everything about this music. And I accosted the director of the group and made him write down for me books I should read. And I was a really annoying 16-year-old nerd. And and then I called my friends back home, and I said, buy some early instruments. When I get back, we're going to start an ensemble.
Hey kids, let's put on a show.
And they said, "Well, what are we going to play?" I said, "We'll figure that out later. We're going to make an ensemble." And we did. We started an ensemble of teenagers, and we had zero idea what we were doing. We didn't know where to get scores or music or editions of anything. So we had our LPs that we worshipped, and so we would spend hours at the turntable dropping the needle on an LP and taking dictation from pieces we liked. I'd say, okay, you do the countertenor voice and I'll do the tenor voice. Okay, ready? And then it was great for our music skills because we learned to take dictation, and we made all of our scores that way by copying them from records.
Wow.
And we had a lot of support from our high school, and started giving concerts at the high school within a few months. I mean, it was all, we were just completely without the slightest training or anything. And our teachers were totally mystified. What is this? What are these crazy kids doing? And they had no idea. But then the following summer, I went to an early music summer school that was a month long. We used to take so much time in those days for these summer courses. And that was in Vermont and was taught by some ex-Pro Musica singers and instrumentalists. And that's where I met all kinds of people who later became mentors and friends. It was my introduction to New York City, where I'd never been before. And it was the summer of 1968. It was
Wow.
kind of a summer where a lot was going on. And it was an extremely dense time. And that's where I was introduced to music of the 14th century, to the Ars Subtilior, to Henry VIII's songbook, to English carols, to the Eton choir book, all kinds of sources I'd never heard of before. And I began kind of making sense of all of this. And then the next year I went off to Conservatory, where there was not yet really any early music beyond the Collegium Musicum, which was a kind of pickup group. But
You went to Oberlin, is that right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And Oberlin had at that time an extremely unusual collegium
Yeah.
run by, as you remember, L. Dean Nurnberger, who was another charismatic personality and a kind of crazy person, and but really inspiring, especially in terms of how to make programs, how to fit things together that don't fit together, how to make connections between repertoire groups, and how to find a text that's a kind of red thread that goes through numerous repertoire groups. And I learned a lot from him. And then during my years at Oberlin, the early music thing started up there. The Caldwells came while I was there, and I was actually the administrative assistant for the first Baroque Performance Institute.
Wow.
I got free tuition in return for helping with chores and organizing things. That was the summer of '72, and and then by the time I left Oberlin in '74, I was really only doing early music. My senior recital fulfilled the letter of the law in that it had to be some German art song, it had to be some French art songs, some opera arias, some English texted songs, and I managed to fulfill all those obligations, and I never sang anything later than 1700. And voice,
Did you make any enemies among the in the voice department?
only the entire voice department.
No.
Although I had a teacher who was really quite supportive, but I think many of the others felt that I'd pulled a fast one on them.
Hmm.
And I think the rules became a lot more rigorous after I left. Also, because I knew nothing about making a program. I knew nothing about how to shape a program. And I just said, oh, I want to sing this and I want to sing this, and we can't leave that out. And I think this recital went on for like 3 hours. It was horrible. So self-indulgent. And I think it was a big problem, and they were happy to see me go.
Well, this is not the moment to ask this question because I'd love to see hear what happens to you after that, and how you end up. You go to New York or something, found Sequentia. But here you are, a voice major in a conservatory that mostly, I think it's fair to say, trains voice majors the way most conservatories train voice majors, which is, yes, with all sorts of important technical skills, but also oriented towards the modern singing career, that is, pointed towards the opera house where possible, and oratorio and other kind of stuff where that might not work out. And generally there's not an idea of an early music specialist. Do you think, or did you think then, that singing early music as you did, and probably you even knew back then that you intended to do that for the rest of your life, is it a different kind of singing from singing?
Singing, yeah. Well, I mean, all the voice teachers I know would tell you that singing allows you to sing early music as well as any other music. You know
Right.
that that's
That's
basically,
yeah.
you're developing an instrument, a tool that you can employ at your will to achieve whatever result you want. That's, I mean, officially what a good vocal technique should allow us to do. It shouldn't force us to sing loud or with a big vibrato or any of those things. Um, I just don't think that at that time, um, the people that I knew on the voice faculty there were much concerned with these things. It wasn't on their screen somehow. They were vocal pedagogues, very dedicated, very concerned about healthy singing. Um, there weren't very many singers who were aiming really for the big, loud opera career. That was more. There were other schools
Yeah.
that could provide that. Won't name names. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I went to Oberlin and not to some other conservatory, was that it had a reputation as being a kind of literary place where you could pursue some kind of intellectual life as well as being a musician. It wasn't just a practice room and a studio. It was an environment with people studying all kinds of humanities, and that appealed to me very much.
That
And
appeals to a great many people in early music for some reason. They like to look around and put the music that they do in some kind of context, intellectual,
yes,
historical,
yeah,
other things. And you do
yeah.
that too with your music. So then what happened? Uh, what happened
Uh,
after Oberlin?
well, after Oberlin, I was awarded a Watson Foundation Fellowship, which is designed for people that don't really fit into the system very well. You know, people who fit into the system do things like Fulbrights or graduate school. And my interests were so weird and kind of uh, off the map that I had to propose my own course of study, which involved a lot of travel and a lot of going to different teachers and different places. And that's kind of the specialty of the Watson Foundation, is self-motivated people with weird projects that involve a lot of travel. And it's basically a financed Wanderjahr,
Hmm.
that you can put your knapsack on your back and take off with no financial worries for one whole year. And so that's what I did. And my project was to go to Europe and also the Middle East and even North Africa to look at what's going on in medieval song, who's doing something with medieval song, and how are they doing it, and where are their influences. And at that time, with no internet, no way to surf and figure out what's going on, you had to go there and meet people and develop your list of addresses and work your contacts. And it was laborious and very slow, as everything was back then. And that's what I did for that first year. And I met a lot of people. I was sort of sometimes a journalist, sometimes a student, sometimes a pain in the neck. But I was traveling a lot. And at the end of that period, I realized that really the only serious thing going on in terms of studying medieval song was happening in Basel at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, where there was a new program that had just been started in 1972 or 3 by Thomas Binkley and Andrea von Rahm, the Studio der Frühen Musik. That was a really hot group in the late 60s and
Certainly
70s.
was, yeah.
And that was the place to be, because they were there as an ensemble teaching, also teaching individually, but also as an ensemble. And then they were surrounded by the entire faculty of the Schola, which was teaching things like history of notation, codicology, the study of old instruments, you name it, history. And so you really got a very wide-ranging and contextualized study plan, and a lot of chances to play concerts, because Basel is a rich musical environment. It always was and always probably will be, but it's also situated in Europe in such a way that you're very close to and many other centers for music, and so a short train ride away, you're in Zurich, or you're in Geneva, or you're in Freiburg, or you're in Frankfurt, or whatever. So I really flourished in that environment, and that's where I met Barbara Thornton. And by the time we had finished our diploma there, we were the first class to get a diploma in medieval music.
Wow.
I think there were 4 of us that year, and we gave a co-recital. So our final concert at the Schola was a concert that we gave together.
You and Barbara.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with numerous other people helping us out, but it was basically 2 of us. And that was actually the central core of our first program as Sequentia. And so we kind of seamlessly went from being students at the Schola into being Sequentia 3 weeks later in a concert in Belgium somewhere.
So you and Barbara Thornton were the founders of Sequentia and continued to be so. And how soon were you, was that taking up a lot of your time? I mean, it's all very well for 2 people to say, here we are, we're Sequentia, and you give a concert somewhere. How did
Yeah.
you develop it into being the amazing phenomenon that Sequentia became?
Well, it didn't happen overnight. It was, as I was saying before about things happening more slowly then,
Yeah.
things like that also happened very slowly. And we had different expectations, I think, at that time. Now you make a recording in order to introduce yourself to the world. And in those days, you made a recording in order to be rewarded for having introduced yourself to the world.
So you have to give concerts and do touring and things like
Yeah.
that before you ever get a recording.
Oh
Right.
yeah, the recording was somehow a way of saying, okay, they're good enough. We'll let them record. And then that in our case that lasted easily 4 years into the founding of the ensemble before we made our first recording.
Wow.
But it doesn't mean we didn't do some radio recordings. And in Germany, of course, the radio is just fabulously widespread, and in those days also very well funded. But in our first years of Sequentia, we had not that many concerts. We did a lot of studying. We did a lot of preparing new programs. We did a lot of searching for colleagues. And we ate a lot of rice and beans.
Well,
We didn't have
Sequentia is
gas.
famous among for many things, but one of them is the recording of the complete works of Hildegard von Bingen,
Mhm.
which must be quite a project. Is that something you started early? I know you finished it only sort of recently. There's an
Yeah.
awful lot of Hildegard, isn't there? When did you start that project?
That project began in the early 80s.
Huh.
So we started working on it seriously in 1981, um, with a view to producing her music drama Ordo Virtutum, and then it just kind of we hung another record onto that one,
Hmm.
because we had a lot of pieces we had already learned and studied, and then the idea was, well, why stop here?
Yeah.
Because the 80s and 90s, especially the 1990s, up until about 97, was an extremely active time in the recording industry. That just everything was being recorded. And there were lots of collaborations between German radio stations, which were publicly funded, and recording companies. So there would be co-productions. So the West German radio would record, and then they would do a co-production with a recording company, and everybody was happy. People were well paid. We had wonderful working conditions, and the marketing was superb. It was a different age than we have now, where there's much more material. It's being shared much more quickly, and you can reach your core audience instantly. In those days, it was a long, long process, very laborious. But when an LP arrived and was published, it was really like an event. When somebody would show up at the Schola with the new LP of Leonhardt or one
Hmm.
of the big stars, everyone would gather around and like touch the holy object, and it had a kind of mythic quality. And LPs are something really large, and they have big pictures and big texts, and you touch them very lovingly. They're fragile. There's something almost religious about the LP, and the role it played in musicians' lives until it was replaced by the CD.
The CDs, I mean, there was still a recording industry even with CDs. And in fact, there was a kind of retro recording industry when they all decided to reissue all the old LPs as CDs. That probably slowed down the hiring of new music also because
Yeah.
they were re-releasing things they already had in the can. And that was the beginning of the big downturn for recording artists. Is that
Yes.
as you would see it, I suppose?
Oh yeah, it was very very easy to feel that happening in the course of the late '90s, and then in Germany, for instance, with reunification, it changed the whole financial structure of the arts
Yeah.
because reunification was so expensive, and it was Germany that was really powering that phenomenon.
Yeah.
You had the big major houses like Deutsche Grammophon and Harmonia Mundi, German Harmonia Mundi, and they were powerhouses.
And that's all was almost all gone now.
Yeah, or they're living off of nostalgia. They're reissuing old recordings
Yeah.
from the 40s and 50s. They're doing big box sets of complete this and complete that, which is easy for them to do. It's not very expensive to produce, and they don't have to pay any artists.
Yeah.
And collect. There'll always be record collectors who buy all kinds of stuff, and
Yeah.
so they'll eke out a living doing that. But in terms of early music, it's really dried up
Yeah.
in terms of the recording industry as we used to know it.
Barbara Thornton was a marvelous singer, an inspiring and inspired performer. Unfortunately, she died some years ago and sort of left you with Sequentia on your own. I know that you maintain Sequentia and have done some wonderful things with other configurations of the ensemble. You've also made something of a career doing other kinds of things, solo work of various kinds. I know a lot of people know of Ben Bagby because he's escaped the musical world, and he's the guy who, among other things, does Beowulf. You've thought about medieval bards and how they deliver these great heroic epic poems, for which obviously we have no musical notation, but we know they were done by bards who maybe had a harp or something or other, and you have reinvigorated that thing. A lot of people think that you can't do Beowulf because we don't have any music for it. It seems to me, at least, that if there's anybody in the world that I would like to listen to perform Beowulf, it's Ben Bagby, and I've heard you do it a number of times, and it's really great stuff. But the life you have created for yourself as a solo performer is really interesting and really has to do with kind of a knowledge of language and literature that is kind of probably important to all early music singers, and maybe the farther back you go, the more important it is. I don't know. Would you reflect on that a bit?
Yes, well, I mean, it's a tradition that goes back into antiquity. The the solo performer of a treasured corpus of stories that everybody knows, and it's kind of a holy thing, and only the the, the caste of the priests are allowed to access it and transmit it to the people. So the bardic function, or the singer of tales, as Albert Lord famously said, this singer of tales function is an integral part of a society, especially a pre-literate society. So if you don't have any writing, then you don't have any records. And if the only way we know who we are and our history is in the mouth of the singer, who can sing genealogies and old stories and remind us of who we are, then that guy he's incredibly important. He's the soul of the tribe or the people, or whatever, the incipient nation. And I think that function in society, of course, with the invention of notation and writing, it became less essential, and with sound recording, of course, completely non-essential. But I think people have an innate feeling for that function in society, and it's good to know that that kind of a person exists, a storyteller. And I think whenever we watch a stand-up comedian we really like, or somebody who is really good at telling a story, or somebody who is able to formulate in words exactly what we're also thinking, it touches that same nerve a little bit. And knowing that that existed in the 8th century or the 6th century or whenever, is somehow interesting for me. And that's what kind of goaded me into saying, okay, there must be a way to recreate this. It can't be that difficult. You have a text, you have a human voice, maybe you have an instrument, and that instrument doesn't have unlimited possibilities. In fact, it has very limited possibilities. And those are the givens. Those are the factors. And if you mix them together and you use a little bit of logic and a little bit of guesswork, you get only so and so many possible renditions. And then you're talking about details like how fast is fast, how slow is slow, how high is high, how low is low. And that's all stuff that I'm willing to talk about. And it's not by any means fixed. But the function is not something that is in doubt. I think that function is really important, and it has passed on through, well, it went into popular culture. You have Cantastorie in Italy, you have the people who still recount the old stories with music, but I think in its original iteration as a tribal art, it must have been something really unbelievable, because that person certainly learned the repertoire from an ancestor,
Yeah.
or an uncle or whatever, and so you're receiving a purely oral tradition, something that was absolutely passed on with great rigor and under threat of punishment from the previous generation, and that is the same kind of thrill that I'm sure a chant scholar gets in looking at a newly discovered chant manuscript.
Maybe even more so. I mean, it's a little bit like medieval television or something. I mean, that's a terrible way to say it, but when I've heard you perform Beowulf, for one thing, I understand why people want a story to go on as long as possible, and why so many of these epic tales give long, 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 long descriptions of things. The modern listener would probably say, "Come on, get on," and then what happened? But
Yeah.
I imagine somehow sitting in a hall with a fire in the middle, and everybody gathered round on a very dark winter's evening, and you have a bard in town, and the bard is prepared to sing you the story of Beowulf. You're in no hurry. We got nothing to do but listen to
Yeah.
the bard tell, and the longer the story is, the
Yes.
better I like it. And that's the impression I get when you give it, that I want it to go on forever. And in a
Wow.
way, it does, or it can,
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
mouth of a good bard, right?
Yeah. Yes, and if I were really historically authentic, which I'm not, I should be able to extemporize the story in my own words every time I tell it, keeping certain portions intact, maybe amplifying others, maybe cutting out others that I sense are not important now. And every retelling should be a unique event. For instance, if there's certain kinds of people in the audience and I sense that they're really into weapons, I might spend more time discussing the weapons and
Uh-huh.
describing them, because people who are into weapons really like to talk about weapons. Or people who are really into beautiful clothing and ornaments and jewelry. I might spend more time describing what such and such a character was wearing and where the fabric had come from and how it was worked and how it was ornamented, and get into enormous long-winded detail about how that person looked, or to describe the beauty of one of the characters or the strength of one of the characters, all those kinds of things. A real singer of tales knows exactly how to gauge that, so that it's absolutely fitted like a glove to the audience. That, you know, our sensibilities are awake. We can sense when something's not going over very well.
Uh-huh.
We cut it short. We move to something else, and we can sense when people are sort of, oh, this is good. I like this part. More of the same. So it's interactive in that respect. If it were truly historically authentic, it would be
Well,
interactive. But then that also means the audience would be a historically authentic audience.
maybe the next phase of Ben Bagby's career is going to be a modern epic tale that he makes up on the spot on the basis of three ideas that are given to him, passed up to the stage. I
Right.
I look forward to that, Ben.
In
Meanwhile,
learning.
you've spent several years up until recently teaching, I think, at a medieval music program at the Sorbonne in Paris, right? You've probably done
Yes.
some other teaching in the past. What do
Yeah.
you think about and that was it's a medieval music program, right? What do you
Yeah.
think about teaching singers of medieval music as opposed to teaching singers, or singers of early music as opposed to medieval music? I mean, I don't know what I'm asking you. What's medieval about medieval music? Or how do you teach it, or why is the program limited that way, or whatever you want to say about it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's largely vocally focused, the program, where I taught at the Sorbonne, and I'm now teaching in Germany as well. All the students are basically singers, because of the fact that the music that has survived from the 12th and 13th centuries is
That's all we
basically
have is vocal music,
it's
right?
vocal music. I mean, you can count the instrumental pieces on your fingers and toes. It's really not that much. And one of course reads descriptions of instrumental music making that are tantalizing. You know, fantastic playing and unbelievable amounts of instruments. But of course, they never wrote any of that down, or if they did, it was an accident. So what has survived is the vocal music. That's because it has a text, or because it was composed by a specific person who was known for that music, like let's say Hildegard von Bingen is a good example. Um, so when I'm then teaching this music, what I'm really teaching is not vocal exercises. I'm not a voice teacher, and I don't do vocal pedagogy because I'm just eminently not qualified for it. So
Well, you're trained at
that's,
Oberlin. Anyway, let's
yeah.
get into that.
Well, they failed miserably. Um, but I'm very interested in the way human voice interacts with text, and the way text interacts with notation, and what notation tells us and doesn't tell us. I mean, here I'm talking to the absolute master.
Oh, poof. Anyway,
What notation tells us and doesn't tell us. You know that there's a lot there to be found out about notation by working with singers who can tell us a lot about what notation has to say. So I'm working with text, I'm working with notation, I'm working with languages, old languages, where there's lots of hypothetical pronunciations at work that we don't really know about. And I'm interested in rhetoric and how a text can be shaped. For instance, you have a composer like Philip the Chancellor, who was in Paris in the early 13th century, and who left us at least 70 songs, some of them highly virtuosic, and obviously to be sung by the greatest singers of Notre Dame Cathedral. So really top of the absolute top of the art singing. But when you look at what Philip the Chancellor was known for in his day, he was a preacher.
right.
And 700 of his sermons have survived in written form. So he was thought of in his time, not necessarily as a composer, but as a preacher. And when you look at some of his songs, they're really long. I mean, there are songs that last 15 minutes, long songs. Um, you see that these are musically set sermons of his. He's actually working on convincing you about something, and he's using all the arts of the rhetoric as they were known by medieval singers and composers to achieve his goal, which is to make a central theological point or moralistic or philosophical point in one of his songs. And that says to me a lot about the way the singers were functioning, that they weren't just great singers who came in and did the gig and sang the piece and then collected their money and went home. They were people who were deeply immersed in the particular scene where they were, and they knew a lot about poetry, they knew a lot about metrics, they knew a lot about rhetorically structuring texts, and they were very gifted with the use of language because they were stand-ins for a great preacher. Just
That's
to name that repertoire.
remarkable, what you say about rhetoric, because students of Baroque music and performers of Baroque music only recently have begun to realize that a lot of Baroque music is about rhetoric. It's
Yeah,
about the
yeah.
same kind of thing that an actor and a preacher and a lawyer are doing, and the
Mhm.
music is doing the same kind of thing.
Yeah,
That's a big jump between Philip the Chancellor and Dietrich Buxtehude, but
yeah,
they may have some things in common.
yeah.
So, what about the concept of early music as a thing? I mean, you've been talking for the last few minutes about medieval music, about things um, a millennium away from what some other people who also call themselves practitioners of early music do. We Does it make sense for us to think of ourselves as a single great body of musicians who care about something that we call early music? Is early music a thing? Does it make sense to think of it this way, or to think of historical performance in the large picture? How do you think? I mean, does it make sense for us to separate ourselves off from the world as some of us do?
I think at the time when I was 16 and 17 and very much immersed in classical music and the whole idea of the masterworks and the great composers and all the rest. Um, I think the idea of early music had something of that 60s feeling of we're going to be against that old way of doing things. We're going to make it new. We're going to do something different. We're going to show that it can be done differently. We're going to identify ourselves by what we are not,
Mm.
by saying we're not these stiff classical musicians who are in a highly competitive world, high powered this and high powered that. We are much more focused on the sources. We're much more focused on the instruments. We're much more focused on the context of music making. It's not just Carnegie Hall all the time. It also could be a chapel. It could be a small room. It could be a tiny Baroque theater. Any number of spaces could qualify. And I think it has to do with context, really, almost more than anything else. That music in the kind of non-early music world, as we used to define it, used to say classical music,
Yeah.
was all about the concert hall. It's all about the very rigorous application of the stage raised above the audience, of the artist entering like a priest entering the holy of holies, and this great veneration of master artists singing or playing masterworks. And the way they gain access to this role in society is by winning competitions and proving themselves, a kind of almost a sort of medieval quest to kill a dragon, to win the Tchaikovsky competition. And and the idea of early music, at least in the late 60s and early 70s, was much more this feeling of liberation. We can do without all of that, and it's just fine. We're making music and enjoying it, and we're not in this kind of pressure cooker of the competitive, especially the competitive nature. But then, of course, over the years, we began to more and more absorb all the attributes of the system that we supposedly wanted to do away with. And now there are competitions,
Yeah.
and now
And you don't mind, I mean, you don't mind being booked for a concert series or doing a recording with a big recording company, do you? You don't say no.
Oh, well, not for that reason. I
Uh-huh.
might say no for another reason, but
Yeah,
not
yeah.
that. And so I don't know if this discussion has been going on now since the 90s about early music authenticity, this stuff. Is it really necessary any longer to keep up this this kind of discourse, this kind of language about what we are not, by identifying ourselves in reaction to something else? Um, and every now and then somebody says we have to stop saying early music. It's earlier than what? I mean, if
Yeah.
I use a synthesizer that uses vacuum tubes to perform Stockhausen from the late 1950s, technically that's early music.
Yep.
So
Using a historical instrument.
what's the big deal? If that's the criterion. But it's more of a mindset thing, and I think that what's happened is that the early music movement or early music idea has much more influenced the classical world, just as the classical world kind of seeped back into ours. I think that there's been an interpenetration, but it goes both ways. And I
Is
don't
that
think it's,
what you would see for the future then is a re-amalgamation, strengthening each side by putting them back together? Look into your crystal ball and tell us about the future of the early music idea, Ben.
well, I mean, look at somebody like Rhiannon Giddens, right? She went to Oberlin. She was an unhappy voice major, just like I was. And I totally get where she's coming from. And then she got into music that had meaning for her in her life. And she started playing the banjo, and she started discovering uh, these wonderful repertoires that nobody knows anything about. And now she's directing the Silk Road project
Yeah.
and doing interesting, wonderful new things. And there's a big element of early music thought and feeling in what she's doing. But when you look at the Silk Road project, I mean, it was founded by Yo-Yo Ma, who couldn't have been more classically trained.
Right.
And yet he also had that side to him that was interested in seeing what's going on behind the curtain, what's under the rug. He was an inquisitive mind, and he still is. And I think that that's kind of the future. The interpenetration of world music with the early music ethos or the worldview, with the rigor of classical music training and devotion to craft, which has always been a hallmark of conservatories. That you really must know your craft. And I think they're all working kind of in synergy now more than ever, because we need to be as creative as possible in today's world to make any music survive.
Ben, I think it's wonderful to hear this much enthusiasm about the future from a guy who's spent a lot of his life doing the earliest music that we have. I hope you're right about that. I think you'll inspire a lot of enthusiasm and hope in the people who are being trained now for the future. And I thank you very much for your collaboration in this conversation.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
very much, Benjamin Bagby.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for your great questions.